February 1945, Pacific Ocean. Japanese pilot Lieutenant Hiroshi Yamada was told the American FM-2 Wildcat was an obsolete, harmless aircraft flown from defenseless escort carriers. But when he encountered them in battle, they tore through his squadron like a coordinated killing machine. And what he discovered after being shot down would shatter everything the Japanese Empire had told him about winning the war. After his capture, when American guards showed him the scoreboard proving FM-2 Wildcats from defenseless escort carriers had destroyed 422 Japanese aircraft, he realized Japan hadn't just lost battles, they'd been fighting a war based on lies their own command knew were false. What did this captured pilot see in American captivity that made him understand Japan's defeat was inevitable before the first shot was ever fired?
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. October 1944. The Pacific Ocean stretched endlessly beneath Lieutenant Hiroshi Yamada's cockpit. At 24 years old, he was one of the Imperial Japanese Navy's surviving carrier pilots, and survival itself had become the rarest skill of all. The war had changed. Everyone knew it, even if no one dared say it out loud. Yamada adjusted his oxygen mask and scanned the horizon. His Zero fighter felt lighter than it should. Fuel was rationed now, even for combat missions. Back at the base on Luzon, mechanics watered down the aviation gas to make it stretch further. Pilots who complained were reminded that the Emperor's divine wind would carry them to victory. Yamada had stopped complaining months ago. The briefing that morning had been simple. American escort carriers had been spotted 200 miles east. These were the small ones, the officers explained, slow converted cargo ships that carried outdated aircraft, easy targets. The intelligence officer had shown grainy photographs of boxy vessels with short flight decks. Jeep carriers, the Americans called them. Floating coffins, the Japanese called them. The planes they carried were even worse. FM-2 Wildcats, ancient designs from 1940. Fat, stubby fighters that the magnificent Zero had outclassed years ago. Yamada remembered his training from 1941. Back then, instructors spent 12 months teaching pilots every detail of aerial combat. They learned navigation by stars, gunnery until their scores were perfect, and aerobatics until the Zero became an extension of their body. Now, new pilots trained for 6 weeks. Some arrived at operational squadrons with barely 20 hours of flight time. They died on their first missions, usually within minutes. The radio crackled. His squadron leader's voice cut through the static. Enemy carriers spotted, bearing 090, 15 kilometers. Yamada's heart rate increased. 15 kilometers, close enough to see smoke from their stacks soon. He checked his ammunition counter. Only 200 rounds remained. That too was rationed now. He thought about home. His mother's letters arrived less frequently now. Paper was scarce, ink was scarce, everything was scarce except promises of victory. The radio broadcasts from Tokyo still proclaimed Japanese superiority. American factories were crumbling, they said. American soldiers were cowards, they said. American equipment was inferior, they said. Yamada wanted to believe it. He had believed it once. The ocean below changed color as they approached the American fleet. Yamada could see the carriers now. Small, yes, just as the briefing described, boxy and ungraceful, but there were more than expected. His squadron of 16 Zeros was approaching at least 6 carriers, each surrounded by destroyer escorts. The math felt wrong. If these were the weak ones, the expendable ones, why so many? Attack formation, the squadron leader commanded. Remember, these are obsolete aircraft. Press your advantage." Yamada moved into position. The familiar pre-combat routine steadied his nerves. Check gun sight, verify ammunition feed, scan for enemy fighters. Everything appeared normal. The carriers seemed almost motionless below, their flight decks tiny rectangles on the vast blue. Then the sky erupted. Fighters rose from the carrier decks like angry hornets from a kicked nest. Not the slow, lumbering climb Yamada expected. These aircraft came up fast, very fast, their engines roaring with power that seemed impossible for obsolete planes. FM-2 Wildcats, they had to be, but they moved nothing like the intelligence reports described. The first Zero exploded before Yamada even saw the tracer rounds. His wingman, a 19-year-old kid named Takeshi, simply vanished in a ball of orange flame. The radio filled with screaming, not battle cries, screaming, pure terror screaming. Yamada twisted his Zero hard right, pulling so many Gs that his vision tunneled. An American fighter flashed past, missing him by meters. He caught a glimpse of the pilot's face through the canopy. Calm, focused, professional. These weren't desperate defenders, they were hunters. Yamada tried to engage. He lined up on a Wildcat and fired. His tracers fell short. The American simply rolled away, and before Yamada could follow, another Wildcat appeared on his tail. They were working together, pairs, coordinated pairs. When he chased one, another appeared. When he evaded one, another was waiting. It was like fighting a single organism with a dozen bodies. His squadron disintegrated in minutes. Yamada counted 3 more fireballs. The radio went silent, except for his squadron leader's last transmission. Break off! Return to base! But half the squadron was already gone. Yamada pushed his throttle forward and dove for the deck, racing just above the wave tops. An American fighter followed briefly, then peeled away. They didn't even waste ammunition finishing him.
The flight back took 2 hours. Yamada's hands shook on the control stick. Fuel ran dangerously low. He landed with less than 5 minutes of gas remaining. The ground crew counted the returning aircraft. 7 came back. 9 never would. In the debriefing room, Yamada tried to explain what happened. The intelligence officer listened with a stone face. "You encountered fleet carriers," the officer said flatly, "not escort carriers. Escort carriers cannot perform such operations. Their aircraft are inferior. You were mistaken." Yamada opened his mouth to argue, then closed it. Around him, other surviving pilots stared at the floor. They had seen the same thing. They knew what they fought. But the official report would say they encountered fleet carriers with advanced aircraft. The official report would maintain the lie. And tomorrow, another squadron would launch believing the same comfortable fiction. Yamada walked out of the briefing room and stood in the tropical night. Above him, stars wheeled in their ancient patterns, indifferent to the lies men told themselves. Something had broken today. Not just his squadron, something deeper. For the first time, Yamada wondered if everything he had been told, everything he believed about American weakness and Japanese superiority, might be as outdated as those wild cards were supposed to be. The thought terrified him more than the battle had. February 1945. 4 months after the encounter that shattered his beliefs, Lieutenant Hiroshi Yamada found himself defending the home islands. American bombers came daily now, wave after wave, more aircraft than Japan could ever hope to build. His new squadron flew from a base near Yokohama with barely enough fuel for 1 sortie per day. The rations had been cut again, rice mixed with sawdust, soup made from seaweed and hope. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The morning briefing was short. Enemy carrier aircraft approaching from the east. Yamada and 5 other pilots scrambled. Their Zeros climbed through thin clouds, engines coughing on the diluted fuel. Yamada spotted them first, a formation of American bombers with fighter escorts. He rolled in for an attack run, lined up his shot, and fired. His tracers reached out, then his engine exploded. The shock was instant. Metal fragments tore through his cockpit. Oil splattered across his canopy, black and hot. The Zero pitched forward into a spin. Yamada fought the controls, but they were dead. Smoke filled the cockpit. His training took over. Canopy release, harness release, push away from the aircraft, pull the ripcord. The parachute opened with a jolt that knocked the wind from his lungs. He watched his Zero spiral into the ocean far below, trailing smoke like a dying comet. The silence after the engine noise was absolute. Just wind in the parachute fabric and the distant hum of American engines. Yamada looked up. A fighter circled him once, then flew away. They could have shot him, they didn't. He hit the water hard. The cold Pacific swallowed him, dragging him down until he kicked free of the parachute. His life vest brought him sputtering to the surface. Ocean stretched in every direction, empty and infinite. He floated for an hour, maybe 2. Time became meaningless. Then he heard engines. A boat appeared. American sailors pulled him from the water. They brought him aboard a ship, not a destroyer, a carrier. He recognized the island structure, the flight deck above. As they hauled him up the side, he read the name on a life preserver, USS Anzio, an escort carrier, one of the jeep carriers he'd been told were harmless. Yamada expected execution or torture. The propaganda had been clear about American barbarity. Instead, sailors wrapped him in a blanket. They took him to a small room and gave him dry clothes. American clothes, too large for his frame. A sailor brought him coffee, real coffee, hot and bitter, in a real ceramic mug. Yamada's hands shook as he held it. He couldn't remember the last time he'd tasted real coffee. A medic examined his injuries. Minor burns on his hands, bruises from the ejection. The medic worked efficiently, applying ointment and bandages, speaking softly in English that Yamada didn't understand. The gentleness confused him more than cruelty would have. These were the barbarians, these calm, professional men treating him like a patient instead of an enemy? They moved him to a converted ready room with a small porthole. A guard stood outside, but the door wasn't locked. Through the porthole, Yamada could see a section of the flight deck. What he witnessed over the next hours destroyed everything, piece by piece. Aircraft launched with mechanical precision. FM-2 Wildcats, the same fighters he'd been told were obsolete. But they didn't launch occasionally or carefully. They launched continuously, one after another, every 45 seconds like clockwork. Yamada started counting. 12 aircraft in 10 minutes. Then they began landing, the same ruthless efficiency. The deck crew moved like a machine, each person knowing exactly where to be, what to do. No wasted motion, no hesitation. He counted the aircraft between launch cycles. 24 fighters on this one small carrier. His last carrier assignment in 1943 had operated 18 aircraft total, and that was a fleet carrier twice this size. The math made no sense, unless everything he'd been told was backwards. A door opened down the passageway. Through it, Yamada glimpsed a mess hole. American pilots sat eating. He saw their trays clearly. Steak, actual steak, thick and brown. Mashed potatoes, green beans, bread with butter. A sailor walked past, carrying a bowl of ice cream. Ice cream, on a warship, in a combat zone. Yamada thought of his last meal before this mission. Watery rice, pickled radish, dried fish the size of his thumb. That meal had been considered adequate for a combat pilot. These Americans fed prisoners better than Japan fed its warriors. The realization hit like a physical blow. More observations followed, each one a hammer strike against his understanding of the war. Through an open hatch, he saw a machine shop. American mechanics were fabricating parts, actually manufacturing replacement components aboard the ship. When Japanese carriers needed repairs, they returned to port, sometimes for weeks. These Americans fixed things at sea, kept fighting without pause. He overheard conversations in English. A guard tried to translate. They were discussing radar contacts, directing fighters to intercepts using electronic eyes. Japan's radar was primitive, short-ranged, unreliable. These Americans guided their fighters through clouds and darkness as if they could see through both. On the second day, something unexpected happened. A guard escorted Yamada to meet American pilots from the squadron that shot him down. VC-10, they called it, Composite Squadron 10. Young men, some barely older than Yamada, sat casually in their ready room. No formality, no rigid discipline, just professionals relaxing between missions. Through an interpreter, they spoke. The squadron leader, a lieutenant commander named Ellis, showed Yamada their scoreboard. Names and numbers covered a large board on the wall. Yamada's English was poor, but numbers were universal. 422. 422 aircraft destroyed by FM-2 squadrons flying from escort carriers. Impossible, Yamada whispered in Japanese. The interpreter translated. Ellis shrugged. We have over 100 escort carriers, he said. Each one carries about 24 aircraft. You do the math. Yamada did the math. His mind reeled. Over 100 carriers, 24 aircraft each, thousands of fighters. And these were just the small carriers, the expendable ones. He'd been told America had perhaps 50 carriers total. The lie was so big he'd never thought to question it. Ellis pulled out photographs. Rows of escort carriers at anchor, dozens of them. Formations of FM-2s, assembly lines producing them. Your Zero was a great fighter in 1941, Ellis said through the interpreter. But war isn't about the best weapon, it's about having enough weapons, training enough pilots, building enough ships. That night, alone in his cell, Yamada stared at the ceiling. He'd fought for honor, for the emperor, for divine wind and spiritual superiority. The Americans fought with mathematics. They built redundancy upon redundancy. They fed their pilots steak and ice cream, not from decadence, but because they could, because their farms and factories produced so much that abundance was ordinary. The war was lost. It had always been lost. Not because Japanese spirit was weak, but because Japanese leaders had sent samurai swords against machine guns and called it strategy. Yamada finally understood, and understanding felt like drowning. April 1945. The transport ship carrying Yamada and 200 other Japanese prisoners docked in San Francisco. He'd spent 6 weeks at sea, wondering what the American mainland would look like. The propaganda said their cities were starving, their factories broken, their people ready to surrender. As the prisoners walked down the gangplank under guard, Yamada saw the truth with his own eyes. The docks bustled with activity that made Tokyo's busiest pre-war days look empty. Cranes lifted cargo containers the size of houses. Trucks rolled past in endless lines, their beds full of crates and supplies. Workers moved with purpose, but without panic, without the desperate urgency he'd seen on Japanese docks, where every gram of material was precious. These Americans worked like men who had plenty of time, because they had plenty of everything. The prisoners were loaded onto buses, clean buses with padded seats. Yamada sat by a window and watched America roll past. Farms stretched to the horizon, fields so vast he couldn't see where they ended. Machines harvested grain, massive combines that ate whole rows at once. In Japan, farmers bent over rice paddies with hand tools, every stalk cut individually. Here, one machine did the work of 100 men. They passed through small towns. Every house had glass windows, real glass, not paper screens. Cars filled the streets, regular people driving them, not just military or government officials. In Japan, gasoline was so rare that most cars had been converted to burn charcoal. Here, people drove to buy groceries. The casual waste of it stunned him. The bus arrived at a camp in central California as the sun set. Barbed wire surrounded neat rows of barracks. Guard towers stood at corners. This was a prison, yes, but the barracks had wooden floors, real beds with mattresses, and windows with screens. Yamada had slept on harder surfaces in the Imperial Navy. A guard showed them to the mess hall for dinner. What Yamada saw there began breaking something deep inside him. The meal was simple by American standards: chicken, rice, cooked carrots, bread, and water. To Yamada, it was a feast he hadn't seen in 2 years. The chicken was real meat, not scraps or bones boiled for broth. The rice was pure white, not mixed with barley or millet to stretch it further. The bread was soft, made from real wheat flour. He ate slowly, trying to make it last, trying not to think about how this prison meal was better than what he'd eaten as an officer defending the emperor. Days passed into weeks. The prisoners worked on nearby farms, guarded but treated fairly. They picked vegetables, harvested fruit, tended crops. Yamada learned quickly that American guards weren't brutal. They were bored. This duty was so safe, so routine, that they treated it like any other job. No beatings, no torture, just work details and return to the barracks. The violence he'd been promised never came.
Then came May 8th. The guards seemed excited that morning, talking rapidly among themselves. Through the few English words Yamada had learned, he caught one phrase repeated over and over. Germany surrendered. The war in Europe has finished. The Americans had won on the other side of the world. That evening, the prisoners were called to the mess hall. Yamada expected nothing unusual, but what he saw stopped him at the door. The tables were covered with food. Not regular food, feast food. Roasted chicken, platters of it, golden and steaming. Mashed potatoes in huge bowls, rivers of brown gravy flowing over them. Fresh bread, still warm, with real butter and blocks. Vegetables he'd forgotten existed. And at the end of each table, plates of pie. Apple pie, thick slices, with crusts that looked like they came from a dream. A guard noticed Yamada's frozen stare. The man smiled and spoke. The interpreter, a Japanese-American named Ken, translated. "The war in Europe is over. This is how we celebrate." Ken paused, then added quietly in Japanese, "This is prisoner food, Yamada-san, for a celebration, for a country still fighting your homeland." Yamada sat down slowly. He picked up a fork, a real metal fork, and cut into the chicken. Juice ran from it. He put it in his mouth. The taste was so rich it hurt. Around him, other prisoners ate in silence, each man dealing with his own private collapse of understanding. This was how America celebrated while still at war. This was what they gave to enemy prisoners to mark a victory. Yamada thought down slowly. He picked up a fork, a real metal fork, and cut into the chicken. Juice ran from it. He put it in his mouth. The taste was so rich it hurt. Around him, other prisoners ate in silence, each man dealing with his own private collapse of understanding. This was how America celebrated while still at war.
This was what they gave to enemy prisoners to mark a victory. Yamada thought of his mother's last letter. She'd written about eating grass soup. Grass, boiled grass with a few grains of rice. His father, a retired admiral, was living on rations smaller than what sat on this prison table. The emperor himself probably didn't eat meals this good anymore. And here Yamada sat, an enemy prisoner, being served pie because America had won a war on the other side of the planet. The farm work continued. Yamada was assigned to a large agricultural operation, thousands of acres of crops. He watched mechanical harvesters process more grain in a single hour than his entire village had harvested in a week back home. He saw refrigerated trucks, technology he'd thought was only for military use, carrying food to markets. He watched farmers throw away produce because it wasn't pretty enough to sell. Vegetables that would have been treasures in Japan tossed like garbage. One day, a farmer paid the prisoners for their work. Actual money. Not much, but some. The farmer, an older man with sun-dark skin, handed Yamada $3 through the fence. "Good work," he said. Ken translated. $3. Yamada calculated quickly. $3 was more than a Japanese lieutenant made in a month. This farmer paid enemy prisoners more than the Imperial Navy paid its officers. That night, Yamada found paper and a stub of pencil. Writing was forbidden, but he needed to put thoughts into words, even if no one would read them. His hand shook as he wrote in Japanese characters. "I have seen the truth they hid from us. America was never starving. Their obsolete FM-2s destroyed us because they had carriers to waste, aircraft to spare, pilots who ate steak before battle. We were told their industry was broken. I now see it produces so much that abundance is ordinary. They throw away food we would treasure. They pay prisoners wages our officers don't receive. Every meal here feeds me better than admirals eat at home." He paused, tears blurring the characters. The war was lost before it started. Not by courage, we had courage. Not by spirit, we had spirit. It was lost by mathematics we refused to see. You cannot fight an enemy who feeds prisoners celebration meals while still at war. You cannot defeat a nation where farmers own machines that do the work of hundreds. How do you win against people who consider ice cream on warships normal? Yamada hid the paper in his mattress. The words changed nothing. Japan would keep fighting until America burned it all down, because admitting this truth was harder than dying. He understood now what he'd really been fighting. Not American soldiers, American capacity. And capacity, he now knew, was something Japan never had. The apple pie sat heavy in his stomach. It tasted like defeat. It tasted like the truth. And truth, he discovered, was the cruelest weapon of all. December 1945. The war had been over for 4 months when Yamada stepped off the transport ship in Yokohama Harbor. Around him, 200 other former prisoners shuffled down the gangplank, each man carrying what little the Americans had let them keep. Yamada clutched a canvas duffel bag, U.S. Army issue, containing 1 wool blanket, 3 cans of rations, and something else, something he'd hidden at the bottom where inspectors wouldn't look too carefully. The harbor, he remembered, was gone. In its place stood a landscape of destruction so complete it looked like the surface of the moon. Buildings were broken teeth against the sky. Cranes that once loaded cargo lay twisted in the water like the skeletons of huge animals. The smell hit him next. Ash and rot and human waste. The smell of a city that had stopped working months ago. This was victory, Japanese style. This was what happened when you fought mathematics with spirit. No one met him at the dock. No family, no officials. Just other returnees wandering into the ruins, trying to find home. Yamada shouldered his duffel and started walking. The train station was destroyed, so he walked 15 miles to his family's neighborhood. His legs, strong from months of farm work in California, carried him through streets he barely recognized.
Children appeared from the rubble as he walked. Orphans, dozens of them, wearing rags and dirt like second skins. They stared at his American duffel bag with hungry eyes. One boy, maybe 7 years old, approached with his hand out. Yamada stopped and opened a can of rations. The boy grabbed it and ran before Yamada could even offer it properly. Other children melted back into the ruins. There were too many to feed, too many for anyone to feed. His family's neighborhood had been hit hard. 3 houses out of every 4 was simply gone, erased by firebombs. But his family's home still stood, partially. The front was intact, the back was open to the sky. Paper screens had been replaced with cardboard. Roof tiles were gone, replaced by sheets of tin that looked like they came from destroyed factories. Yamada stood in the street for a long moment, gathering courage, then walked to the door. His mother answered. She was smaller than he remembered, thinner, her face creased with new lines. For a moment she didn't recognize him. Then her hand went to her mouth, and tears came. She pulled him inside without words. His father appeared from the back room. The retired admiral looked old now, truly old, his uniform jacket hanging loose on a frame that had lost 20 pounds. They sat on the floor in what remained of the main room. His mother brought tea. Not real tea, roasted barley in hot water, the closest thing to tea that existed anymore. She served it in chipped cups with shaking hands. Then she brought food, the meal she'd prepared for her son's return. Watery rice porridge, 2 pieces of pickled radish, a small amount of dried fish, carefully divided into 3 portions. Yamada looked at the food and thought of apple pie. He thought of celebration chicken. He thought of mashed potatoes with gravy. This was what his mother had saved, had planned, had treasured for his homecoming. This meal probably represented a week of her rations. He picked up his bowl and ate slowly, each bite tasting like broken glass. His father asked the question carefully, as if the words might explode. Was American captivity brutal? His eyes searched Yamada's face for confirmation, for something that would make the defeat easier to bear. Tell me they were monsters. Tell me we were right about them. Give me that much. Yamada set down his bowl. He looked at his father, this admiral who had believed in Japanese superiority, who had sent young men to die for the emperor's divine wind. He looked at his mother, eating her tiny portion of pickled radish as if it were a feast. The truth would destroy them. The lie would be kinder. But Yamada had seen too much truth to go back to comfortable lies. "Father," he said quietly, "I ate better as their prisoner than you eat as a free man now. That is what we fought. That is what we lost against." The silence that followed was absolute. His mother's chopsticks stopped halfway to her mouth. His father's face went through several expressions, shock and anger, and finally something like understanding. The old admiral looked down at his watery porridge and nodded once, slowly. They didn't speak of the war again that night. Instead, his mother asked about small things. Was he hurt? Was he treated fairly? Did he need anything? Yamada answered carefully, editing out the steak and ice cream, the casual abundance, the celebration feast for prisoners. Some truths were too cruel to speak aloud. But his father's eyes stayed on him, knowing there was more, afraid to ask for details that would make the defeat even harder to bear. That night, Yamada slept in his old room. The roof above his bed was gone, replaced by canvas stretched across broken beams. Through gaps he could see stars, the same stars that had wheeled above him in California, above him on the carrier, above him in his Zero before it all fell apart. The stars didn't care about defeat or victory.
They just burned, indifferent and eternal. Days became weeks. Yamada looked for work in a city that had no work to give. The factories were destroyed. The offices were rubble. Men with engineering degrees swept streets for rice rations. Former officers begged on corners. The economy had collapsed so completely that money was nearly worthless. People traded in cigarettes and rice, the only currencies that mattered. He found occasional day labor, clearing rubble, rebuilding what the bombs had broken. The work was hard, but it kept his mind busy. At night, though, the thoughts came. He would lie under his canvas roof and remember the mechanical harvesters, the refrigerated trucks, the casual waste of a society so wealthy it didn't know it was wealthy. Japan would rebuild, eventually. But how many years? How many decades? How far behind had they fallen while their leaders fed them lies about American weakness? One morning, his father called him to the back room. The old admiral held a newspaper, one of the thin sheets that had started printing again. "They're looking for teachers," he said. "Engineering teachers. The Americans want us to rebuild industry." He paused. "They're offering real wages, rice rations." He looked at Yamada. "You should apply." Yamada took the teaching position at a technical school in Yokohama. The school was in a partially destroyed building, but it had a roof and desks and students hungry to learn. These young men, teenagers mostly, hadn't fought in the war. They wanted to understand how to build the new Japan, whatever that would be. Yamada taught them industrial engineering, manufacturing processes, quality control. But he taught them something else too, carefully, quietly, in ways that wouldn't shame them. He taught them that elegant design without production capacity was art, not industry. He taught them that the finest weapon in the world meant nothing if you could only build 10 while your enemy built 1,000. He taught them to think in terms of systems, not just individual pieces. He never mentioned the FM-2 Wildcats directly, never spoke of the 422 aircraft they destroyed, never told them about escort carriers that rivaled Japanese fleet carriers. But the lessons were there, hidden in mathematics and engineering principles.
At home, he kept the duffel bag in a corner of his room. His mother asked about it once. "American bag," he said. "They let us keep our things." She nodded and never asked again. But inside that bag, wrapped in the wool blanket, was the flight manual. The FM-2 Wildcat flight manual that Lieutenant Commander Ellis had given him the day before he left the carrier. On the inside cover, Ellis had written in careful English, "To a worthy adversary. May you build peace as earnestly as you fought war." Yamada never showed the manual to anyone, but sometimes, late at night, he would take it out and study it. Not the technical details, though those were there. He studied it as evidence, proof that what he remembered was real, proof that the abundance, the capacity, the overwhelming power of American industry wasn't a dream or a nightmare, but a simple fact. Years passed. Yamada married, had a son. Japan began rebuilding in earnest, learning from its defeat, adopting American methods. Factories rose from the ashes, built on principles of mass production and efficiency. The economy grew. Food became available again. His mother gained back her weight. His father lived long enough to see Japan sign a peace treaty, long enough to see the occupation end, long enough to understand that defeat had, perhaps, saved them from complete destruction. His son was 10 years old when he found the flight manual. Yamada came home from the technical school to find the boy sitting on the floor, the manual open in his lap. "Father," the boy asked, "why do you keep this American book?" Yamada sat down beside his son. He looked at the manual, at Ellis's inscription, at the technical drawings of an aircraft that had helped destroy the empire. How did you explain to a child born after the war? How did you make him understand?
This manual represents 422 reasons, Yamada said slowly. 422 Japanese pilots who died. Each one shot down by aircraft we were told were obsolete, flown from carriers we were told were harmless. He paused. I keep it so we never forget an important lesson. What lesson? His son asked. That courage and spirit cannot defeat factory production lines. That Bushido and honor cannot win against mathematics and abundance. That the future belongs to those who build prosperity, not those who worship scarcity and call it strength. Yamada touched the manual gently. Your grandfather's generation believed the Japanese spirit made us invincible. They were wrong. Spirit cannot defeat statistics. Prayer cannot defeat engineering, and pride cannot defeat truth. His son looked at the manual with new eyes. Did we lose because we weren't brave enough? No, Yamada said firmly. We lost because our leaders knew we couldn't win and sent us to die anyway. They knew America's factories. They knew about the abundance. They had to know. And they lied to us, to the pilots, to the people, to themselves. 422 pilots died not because they lacked courage, but because our leaders lacked honesty. The boy was quiet for a long moment. Then he asked the question that Yamada had been waiting for, the question that mattered most. What did you really learn in America, father? Yamada stood and walked to the window. Outside, Yokohama was rebuilding. Cranes lifted steel. Workers poured concrete. Japan was learning, slowly, painfully, the lessons that defeat had written in fire and blood. I learned that war is not won by the bravest warrior or the finest weapon, he said. It's won by the nation that can afford to call its best weapons obsolete while still winning. Those FM-2 Wildcats destroyed 422 of our aircraft because America could build thousands and we could not. He turned to face his son. I learned that my captors fed me better than my own empire fed its soldiers, not from cruelty to us, but from abundance we couldn't imagine. Ice cream on warships, celebration feasts for prisoners, farmers who threw away food we considered precious. And the most important lesson? Yamada picked up the manual. That Japan never knew. We never knew how far behind we were. We never knew that we were bringing swords to a machine gun fight. We never knew that our leaders had sacrificed us to protect their own pride. He handed the manual to his son. I keep this so you will know, so your generation will know, so Japan will never again mistake spiritual slogans for industrial reality. His son held the manual carefully, as if it were sacred. In a way, it was. Sacred evidence, sacred truth, sacred reminder of the price of lies. Yamada looked out the window again at the rebuilding city. We fought for honor, he said quietly. America fought with mathematics, and mathematics won. Remember that. Always remember that. The manual stayed in the family for decades, passed down as a reminder of what pride costs when it replaces truth. And every generation that held it learned the same lesson that Yamada had learned in the skies above the Pacific, on the deck of an escort carrier, and in the orchards of California, that the cruelest defeat comes not from the enemy's weapons, but from your own leader's lies. That was what Japan never knew, until it was far, far too late. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.